Circle. I am John Kane. No, I can't do this. I'm sorry. I got to take off the mask. Sorry. I was going to try it. Couldn't do it. Just demonstrating it. Circle, I'm John Kane. Welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Saturday, April 4th, 2020. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We kind of break the rules here for Native Radio. We don't do prayers. We don't do buffalo speeches. We don't try to mystify being Native. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that's heaped upon us. And we do it all live right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people that you can stream the audio of the show live while we're doing it on our website at www.letstalknative.com. We stream live video of the show on Facebook Live, on our group page, in fact, several group pages. We take the audio, we put it up on SoundCloud, which puts it out as a podcast on. You can find it on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We take the video and we put it up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcasts, and I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also encourage you to stop by our website anytime. We have links to our podcast. We have links to the video. We also have a store where you can get some Let's Talk Native merchandise, including some shirts that Jake personally worked on to kind of send a message. We've got a Run of the Gaia shirt. We've got a couple of takes spoofs on the Wizard of Oz, as well as Lincoln the Executioner. Yeah, there's some shirts worth taking a look at. Not to mention, I think we've even got like a couple of white skin T-shirts to counter, that other team. So anyway, check out what's that? Oh, and of course we have the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women shirts as well. Hey, let me get into it. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time going through the COVID numbers. They are terrible. This thing is spreading as fast as anybody could have predicted. The United States, in spite of Trump's bragging about how wonderful he's doing, managing this thing, is basically out of control. And it's out of control on a couple of different levels. Not only does the United States, are they almost double any other country in terms of total cases. They're third on the list for the number of deaths caused by COVID-19. But the likelihood is they'll probably overtake France and Spain on this. Countries like Spain has overtaken Italy. Italy was considered the hot spot. Nobody's talked about Spain as much as they have Italy, but things are going really bad in Europe, and they're going really bad here in the United States. And I don't want to make light of this thing, because in spite of those people who will tout, oh, we're going to be fine, we're going to survive, not everybody's going to be fine. There are people dying, and there will be more people dying. The death rate at this point is is really just the tip of the iceberg on this thing, and we don't know how long this is going to last. People are talking about the apex. When you hear Governor Cuomo talk about New York City reaching its apex, well, that's fine for New York City, but there are places like Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles and New Orleans and all, Cleveland, all these other cities, cities down in Florida, cities in Texas, that are a little bit farther behind in their curve, so to speak. So when does the United States reach its apex, as Andrew Cuomo talks about? It's probably not till sometime in the summer. I mean, this is, and of course you've got several states in the heartland that have no stay-at-home orders, and many states that may have them, but it's kind of being dismissed. I mean, there are states where people are still doing anti-COVID parties. They're intentionally gathering to mock and to dismiss this whole thing as a hoax. You have church organizations. You have a couple of states that have said, well, we're considering church gatherings an essential necessity. Which is bizarre. I don't know. I don't know even know how to address this idea that you should stay at home except for to go to church or choir practice. But this is the reason that there will be no shortening of the curve. This is going to drag out, coast to coast, and of course, it isn't going to be stopped by state borders. It's not going to be stopped by national borders and that kind of stuff, because there are still a lot of people who are moving across these man-made lines. So it's going to get very bad. I think New York City is now seeing this wave that's moving out of the city towards east from across Long Island. Long Island is starting to have some incredible numbers, and of course, even way out here on the in the western area of New York, the county just north of us, Erie County, has almost 800 over 800 cases, and these numbers are starting to rack up. So it is really concerning. The story changes a little bit now. Everybody's being advised, to wear a mask when they go outside or when they do go out into public, whether they're grocery, shopping or whatever. Look, all I can say is stay home. The best thing you can do is stay home and, try to ride this thing out. And I know it's tough. And now you're hearing, the president of the United States, trying to hedge back and forth between, yes, the stay-at-home orders that he suggested should continue for another 30 days. Now he's trying to renege on that a little bit. The other piece of advice is ignore the moron from the White House. That's the only other thing I could suggest to you do, because some of the doublespeak that comes out of Trump or his family members, Kushner or anybody else, it just adds to the confusion. So try not to follow the advice of people that are ignorant. And look, I know there's a lot of stuff on Facebook, trying to attribute this to 5G and to, a man-made virus, intended to, impose martial law. Look, you can believe what you want to believe. And if that helps feed something that's a part of you, then by all means. But make no mistake about it. This thing is spreading wherever it came from, and everybody has their opinion on that. But this thing is spreading. It is taking lives. And eventually everybody's going to know somebody. I mean, let me put this into a little bit of perspective. There was an island off the coast of Italy, part of the nation of Italy, that upon the first death, they tested everybody. And I don't know what the volume of people was, a couple thousand people, I guess. And at that moment, 3% of this population, this village, tested positive. So at the onset of one death within a certain population, testing proved that 3% of the population had the disease. Of that 3%, 45% had no symptoms whatsoever. So almost half of the people who tested positive didn't know they were sick, didn't know they were carrying the disease. And so eventually that 3% can grow. But just think about this for 1 second. If 3% of the U.S. population should end up carrying this disease, test positive if they could ever test 330 million people, which won't happen, that's almost 10 million people. At this point, when you look at the numbers, you realize that the mortality rate is actually growing. It's not getting less. And of course, it stands to reason because they are testing sick people. They are testing the broad-based population. But right now, the mortality rate's coming in at almost 5% globally, up from less than 4%. So these are scary numbers. Now, I know Trump threw out numbers like, this could, cause 100 to 250,000 deaths. And frankly, I think he threw a big number out there, hoping that anything that comes in less than that will show that, what a great success he has had in managing this thing. The scary part is those numbers are probably not unrealistic based on when you look at all the numbers throughout the world. And at this point, I use a website called Worldometer, and you can go to the coronavirus screen. They have a whole bunch of stats on that site. What they've added to that is the number of tests that were conducted by each country. At this point in the United States, only 0.5% of the population has been tested. So not even 1% of the U.S. population has been tested. It's just it is really worth noting this, because this is anybody who thinks that it's a lot of people. It's a relatively small percentage. I mean, in the United States, there's over 311,000 cases that have tested positive, but that's only testing. That's only testing about 0.5%, less than 0.5% of the population. So, look, there's a long way to go. We're going to be talking about this probably each show. I'm going to have to throw something out there. I will say that as I sit here on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, we still have no confirmed cases here on Seneca territory. So that's a positive note. I know other territories can't say that. Six Nations has a bunch. Navajo territory is basically inundated with it, but. So that's where we stand with this. Hey, I want to talk about something that I've kind of talked about before, but I've used other language about it. And part of the conversation that I've had basically has been introduced to this show by my friend Dagarundage, Paul Delarome. He's oftentimes talked about the difference in the distinction between rights and responsibilities. And he said there are no rights if there are no responsibilities. You can't claim a right if you can't accept a responsibility. Well, I want to go beyond the notion of rights and actually talk about power and authority. First, on the power thing, one of the words that I've become increasingly uncomfortable using is the word sovereignty. And I know the word sovereignty has been appropriated by Native people. We use it all the time. We talk about tribal sovereignty, or I'm sovereign, I'm this. But the reason I'm having trouble with that word, the more I've thought about what it means, where it comes from, that kind of thing, it's a French word, and it really comes from this idea that God has ultimate power, and that there is one of the greatest lies ever told is that God himself has granted certain families with power over others. So when they talk about royal families, for instance, the crown, that these monarchs are appointed by God, and that they are the sovereigns. They are the power. They have the power over other people. And see, that's what sovereignty is. Sovereignty doesn't mean freedom. To be sovereign doesn't mean that you're free. It means that you have power. And what governments, the different types of, isms, I guess, or styles of government, have different views on where sovereignty rests within their nation. So, is a monarchy, the sovereign is the crown, it's the king, it's the queen, it's that royal family, and that they are the sovereign, and they have the power over everybody. In other types of governments, you may have, the sovereignty may be spread out. In a democracy, for instance, the sovereign is the people en masse. Only the group, the individuals are sovereign, but the group represents the sovereign. In a republic, the sovereignty extends down to the individual. It's a birthright. Well, and this is where some of this stuff gets awkward. So when a country claims to be sovereign, what they're saying is they have power, and they have a specific place that power is vested. So, in our culture, as not only as Ongwe, but as Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee, it isn't about power. It's about responsibility. But we talk about that we are free and independent people, and the only power that we claim is the power to decide for ourselves, not the power to inflict over or to assert over land, or not the power to impose over others. That's a European concept. And and other countries have had it too, and maybe even other native territories have had this sense of power being vested in an individual, or a group of individuals, that power can be asserted over others. But so power and authority are, those are words that are kind of interchangeable. I oftentimes hear people talk about the authority that they have, and and I talk about this sense of empowering our youth, for instance, youth empowerment. So those are the things that I become concerned about. You almost knocked the interface off. So I get concerned about us utilizing some of these concepts that are really kind of, they're not ours. So that's what I get concerned about. So when I hear people talk about authority or land ownership, that's another thing where power and authority come in. I think it's important that we need to revisit our language so we can have a better understanding of this, because I think things get lost in translation. We had this we referred to peace, power, and righteousness as key elements of Haudenosaunee people that we, but again, when we use words like peace, power, and righteousness, those are nouns. And in our language, peace is not necessarily a thing, it is a process. Power that we talk about in this sense of peace, power, and righteousness is not the power over others, it's the power of our minds. We talk about the power of the good mind. It's that we have the power of reason. And other living creatures don't necessarily have this power to rationalize and make decisions based on the future, or based on cause and effect. Nature is balanced, and a lot of the instincts that other living creatures have work their way out in terms of that stuff. But man, because we do have an insatiable appetite, we're also given the power of reason, which we're supposed to use to balance that appetite. So again, peace and power are not this idea of authority over others, and it's not this idea that peace is something that you fight for, but that you find a way to maintain that peace. The righteousness thing isn't just this idea of good versus evil. That's not our concept. The whole idea of righteousness is, it actually is the opposite of what you might find in the Bible. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. See, we wouldn't look at that as a righteous way to maintain peace. If somebody lost an eye, the way that you would resolve a conflict that may have resulted in that eye isn't to take the eye of somebody else. It's to let that person's eyes be used to help this person who lost an eye. I mean, so it isn't this idea that you retaliate with an equal force or an equal wrong to try to construct that two wrongs make a right. We also wouldn't, the whole idea of turning a cheek and getting slapped twice is not something that we would adopt in our culture. We would, if a violent act was committed against somebody, we wouldn't just say, obviously it was important for you to slap me, so I'm going to turn the cheek and let you slap me again. No, we would try to rationalize and use a righteous process to address that act of aggression so that we stop. So we stop the act. We don't encourage it by saying, it's obviously important to you to slap me, so I'm going to turn the cheek and let you slap me again. So those Christian concepts stand in direct contradiction to ours. So, I think it's important to explain that. Look, and I know there's probably some preachers out there saying, "Oh, I'm misunderstanding what the concepts mean." Well, look, there's plenty of violence in many religious books, not just the Bible, but the Torah, the Quran, and there have been millions of people. In fact, most of the conflicts on the globe have arisen out of people's religious beliefs. So I'll just leave it there. But again, I think so. When we use words, the English words, we should delve back into our language or those people who understand the language, so we have a better idea of the concepts. Because when we talk about, again, even land ownership, the way it was taught to me, and I'm not trying to contradict or stand in direct opposition to what anybody else has ever said. What it was explained to me is that we don't own the land. Our future generations do. That when we talk about the title, so when we talk about women having the being title holders, what we're saying is because they give birth to the next generation, and it's not just women; it's the female of any species. That part of their responsibility, and of course with human beings, we have a rational way of dealing with that responsibility. That we know that the our future generations are born out of our women. So women have a unique responsibility when it comes to the land. But I oftentimes tell the story that I once heard from Gunnar Ratillo, who basically tells the story of a white man coming upon a native village, saying that he wanted to buy a parcel of land and he wanted to know who owned the land, and the person he speaks to says, well, the landowner isn't here. And he said, well, when will the landowner be here? And the gentleman that he asked, the native gentleman, looks and as he peers off to the side, he sees a young woman with a round belly, and says, well, looks like probably in about 4 months. So the person inquiring about the land comes back 4 months later or thereabouts, and said, want to, again, is there any way I can speak with the landowner? And the same gentleman looks and sees, not only is that woman now with her young, but sees another woman who's pregnant, and says, well, I don't expect the landowner to make an appearance for another 3 months or whatever. So this goes on, and eventually the moral of the story is that the future, the unborn, are the ones who the land is attributed to. I mean, the land ownership is a tough concept, but in our culture we talk about the future. The land belongs to the future, if you want to talk about ownership. And so our responsibility, once we are born, now our jobs are to maintain that land and to ensure that future generations. And this isn't, again, it's not a man thing, a human thing. We attribute the responsibility of that it's the future generations of all of creation that the land is attributed to. So when I hear our own people talk about owning land, I understand that it's almost a shortcut, right? It's a way to talk about more that it's more about talking about our rights but see, here's where this gets difficult, because the doctrine of Christian discovery looked and they saw how we viewed land. I mean, the white people who came, the Europeans, and they said, they don't own the land. They just occupy the land and they keep it for the future. So we're going to claim the land as Christians. We've made the determination that not only do Native people themselves not view themselves as land owners, but because they don't, we can. Because we don't have to look at them in the same eyes or as human beings that look at land as something that you can own and occupy, or own, but only reside on. So they use this idea of land ownership as a means to not only to strip us of land rights and occupation on that land, but then assert power, again, over the land and the people on that land. So we try to balance that by trying to use the same argument against them. Say, no, the land is ours. This is our land. And we talk about, we say it's Seneca land, or we say it's Mohawk land, or it's but if we say those things, it's one thing to say them, but I think we should make sure that we understand conceptually that within our culture, we don't view land ownership, in the same way. that Europeans do. And that doesn't mean that we should be victims because of that. In fact, I think the whole concept of the land owning you rather than you owning the land makes a lot more sense. And look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break and we'll come back and we'll discuss this a little farther. Again, I want to get more into this idea of authority versus responsibility. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to thank my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises, the folks at Grand River Enterprises and Native Wholesale Supply. Look, without the support of these main sponsors, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing here. And look, they've kept up, in spite of what's going on right now. These guys are still supporting what we do here. We're doing 3 shows a week out of this studio. We used to do just the 2, just the Let's Talk Native on Saturday nights and Tuesday nights, but I'm no longer making the trip to New York. So Jake's coming in helping me do my New York show from here, which is Thursdays, by the way, on WBAI. But we also stream that on Facebook Live, and we put it up as a podcast as well. That's Thursdays from 3 to 5. That's a 2-hour show. And because we link up with our New York studio, we can take phone calls. So we get some spirited conversations going on down there. We get a few haters out there every once in a while, but it's a good conversation. But look, yeah, I want to thank the sponsors because I couldn't do these shows and some of the other video work that Jake and I work on if we didn't have the support. I also want to thank those of you who share the videos of the show, our short form videos. Those of you who share the podcasts. Look, I've got over 8,000 people on the group page associated with this, the Facebook group page associated with this program. And look, many of you engage me. Many of you comment as we stream it on Facebook. And I appreciate the input. Good to hear from Matt, by the way. I see Matt from our old intercom days offering a comment. So I'll say hello out to Matt. But look, I appreciate those of you who listen to the show and share the show and especially offer your comments. And look, you're fair. You are free to disagree. And I know when I'm talking about some of these concepts, because when I talk about things like sovereignty being a bit of a problematic word, I know that's probably not something that people have heard much of. I mean, because that's, again, the idea of sovereignty is something that we've appropriated it, and I think it's worth having a conversation, because I get real concerned about this idea of asserting power and authority over land and over people, especially when there's a concentration of that power and authority, which is kind of why I wanted to do the show that I'm doing today. And I've talked about this before because, again, Dagarundage is always, he's quick to point out the difference between rights and responsibilities. And if you look in the Guyana Lagoa, a lot of what is laid out there, people say, well, we want to know the right and the power of the people. But it's more about the responsibility that people have. And it's not just chiefs and clan mothers. We talk about how we gather and we counsel as men. We gather and we counsel as clans. We gather and we counsel as we even have what we call medicine societies. There are any number of groups within a community that we say have a fire. They have their own fire, and by that we mean they have the right to counsel, and they have the right to come up with decisions or develop plans or actions or whatever else. So, but to do that, you have to be responsible enough to be engaged. So a lot of this isn't about whether you put somebody in a position of authority. It's about you put them in the position of service. So again, when we talk about title holders, for instance, oftentimes, and I've seen the bumper stickers, says honor the chiefs. Well, okay, I'm not saying dishonor anybody, But let's not lift people up, because that is, again, that's a contradiction of our culture. We talk about everybody's head being at the same height, and that we're equal. Now, it doesn't mean that we're all the same. It just means that no one has more power than anybody else. And look, I've heard some people, they almost do a little bit of doublespeak. They'll say, no, we have no authority except for the authority the people give us. Well, the people don't actually give you authority. I've once said, the best way to prevent the abuse of authority is to not give it. And the best way to solve an abuse of authority is to make sure you take back whatever authority somebody has been asserting. But the problem is, we don't want to be responsible. Because if we just think, well, that's your job, we put you in that position, so that responsibility is yours. Well, that's us, failing in our responsibility. When we put people in a position, whether we elect them or whether, they go through, a traditional process, those people are our servants. And it's up to us to have those servants perform the service for us. We may give them a responsibility to carry our voices, but we don't give them the responsibility to speak for us. We don't give them, when we talk about Grand Council, decisions aren't made at Grand Council. They're announced at Grand Council. The decisions are made back with the people. Our process for dealing with tough issues isn't send everybody to Grand Council and make a determination, make a ruling that they don't impose it upon people. It's to discuss it, take it back to our communities, take it back to our clans. It's a slow process. But you see, we've altered that, and we don't necessarily follow what the Guyana or Goa says. And that's why we've had failures in this stuff. And that's why, even as we use English, look, I've heard people say, well, you can't communicate in English. That's simply not true. You can. You just have to avoid using words that are inappropriate. And if you do use a word that isn't an accurate translation, then we have to take the time to define that word when we say it. So if we're going to use the word sovereign or sovereignty, we have to say, well, that's the right and responsibility to make decisions for ourselves. It's not power that we assert over others. And again, when we talk about land ownership or authority over land, we start to sound like them. That's what the Bible says, right? Assert dominion over the land or over the creatures of the earth. That's the first chapter of the Bible. That's Genesis. That we as man were created to assert power over the earth. Well, that's not a Haudenosaunee concept. No, we don't look at the earth as something that we subdue. And so when we use language that doesn't translate properly, we have to be a little bit more careful. And here's the problem. Our language is not noun-based, and English is. And in fact, many of the more, the Latin languages, they're very much noun-based. So they have labels. Our words are descriptive. I mean, and all words start from a place of metaphor, right? So if we describe something, we oftentimes say what it's like. So, that's how we, that's how we communicate. But even in our language, we do that. But if those words in those descriptors become trite or overused, then all of a sudden the image created by them goes away. So we end up relying again back on labels. So it's important that even if you don't speak our original languages, that you find out where a concept comes from and what is the best way, again, to translate it into English, so we don't lose the essence and we don't lose the idea. I mean, one of the words that the Dagarundage is quick to explain because it's so different when you understand the native perspective. Again, to borrow Ed Schindler's comment, what were we thinking? The word Yoganuru is the word that we use for rain, but it's not a noun. It's a description. It literally translates to say, we know that it's precious. So when we use this expression, yogonuru, we're referring to something that we understand has a unique value, and we actually give it the name, that talks about how precious it is. We don't talk about it. It doesn't translate. It doesn't come from water falling from the sky. So we don't give it that kind of definition. Instead, we give it a definition that is descriptive. So, I mean, that's just an example of how the language can. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't. If we say yogonuru, so whether we're talking about rain or some other type of moving water, we can still use it, and people can still translate it and understand what we're talking about. But when we talk about things like power and authority and rights, there's not a whole lot of words in our language that translates to that kind of concept. So we have to be careful when we use those words that we frame them properly, I guess. So I think that's really what I'm trying to say here. And so I caution people, because if that's the conversation you're having, not only with our own people, but other people who don't understand that when we use a word like sovereignty, we're framing it differently, then we have to take extra time and explain it. So I'm very cautious when I hear, people use a shortcut. So when we use things like the creator, as opposed to referring to the power of creation. I mean, it's funny, as much as, oftentimes we use these shortcuts, there's also places in language that we get too verbose, as they say. I mean, it's like, if you're Onondaga, if you're Seneca, it's enough just to say you're Onondaga or Seneca. But instead we hear people say, well, I'm an enrolled member of the Seneca tribe. Really? You had to make it a whole sentence that long, that many words, which means something different than to say that you're Onondaga. Because now you've used words like enrolled, which means that you're a name on a piece of paper, and that you're a member, like it's something that you signed up for because it's a piece of paper, right? And that and even the word words Seneca Nation. The word nation is not one of our words. Onondaga means the people of a place, the land of mountains and big hills. Gunyagahaga means the people of a place where flint is plentiful. Onyotaaga, the people of the lands where stones stand out of the ground. So these are words, and it doesn't say the nation of this or the nation of that. Nation is like a box. It's not our box. It's a box that was created by monarchies, by these sovereigns again, right? So I'm not saying we can't use the words. I mean, in fact, my friend Sogrieta, he called into into my show in New York because my co-host Regan, she'll use a word like tribe. Or she'll use, other words that, depending on where you are in this idea of decolonizing your mind, that may not be the priority in terms of correcting the language. And so I take the criticism, and look, I echo that criticism, not to criticize my co-host, but just to frame it, right? So I want to make sure that that if we do use words, look, there are people, indigenous is another word, right? I'm sometimes uncomfortable. I'm not saying I don't ever use the word. But part of the reason I have trouble with the word is because the international definition of indigenous suggests that we are merely descendants of a people who predate colonization. So it's like the word is framed about being occupied, about being a subdued or subjugated people, and or just a mere descendant of a people, and I have problems with that. So if I use the word indigenous, I oftentimes have to explain what I mean by it, and sometimes I have to address that I don't concede to the international definition. And so whether we use words like indigenous or Aboriginal or First Nations or American Indian or Native American or any of that stuff. I have problems with all of it. That's why, for me, I use a word like something benign, like the word native, if I'm going to use an English word. But I would rather use ongwe. I would rather use Ganyagahaga. I would rather use, Haudenosaunee or Rudenosaunee. I would rather use words that somebody else can't assume what they mean unless they assume wrong on some of these things. And then, so I can make the correction. So that's kind of, I think language matters. Steve Newcomb, friend of mine who basically taught the world about the doctrine of Christian discovery. One of the things that Stephen Newcomb did was he asked the question: did tribes exist before European contact? And of course, the answer is no. No, they didn't exist, because that wasn't a concept that we had. And and of course, what does tribe mean? Depending on where you look it up. For one thing, if you look up the word tribe in the dictionary, and it mentions Native American or something like that, that's like putting the cart in front of the horse here, because that was a word that was imposed upon us. It doesn't come from us. So to say that's what it's come to mean, well, here's the problem that I have with a word like tribe. If you listen to the talking heads on television, you'll often hear them talking about, that sure was a definite or an example of tribalism. They don't mean it in a complimentary way. If they talk about, the tribal regions of Afghanistan, they aren't talking about the sophisticated people. They're talking about primitive people. So the word tribe, as it's used today in the common vernacular of news cycles, always has a negative connotation to it. So I think it's important that if we're going to understand what tribal and tribalism means, that it's a negative thing, then how can the word tribe be a positive thing? It's not meant to be anything other than derogatory and be a substitute for something like a primitive people. So that's why I have problems with it. And so these are the challenges. And of course, the problem is we have been so indoctrinated to these labels that have been imposed upon us that we eventually begin to accept them. Look, this plays into the mascot issue. I mean, there was a period of time that Native people oftentimes would be drawn to a team like the Washington football team. And they may not have been offended by the word Redskin. They may have been drawn to the Atlanta Braves or the Cleveland Indians or the Chicago Blackhawks. Why? Because there was so little in the dominant culture around us that we could relate in any way, shape, or form to, that we clung to the scraps they dropped that fell off the table, right? So these derogatory terms, these appropriations, and they were never talking about us. The Washington Redskins aren't Native people. They were all white people at one time. Now they're predominantly black people wearing tights, playing football. If you ask somebody what a Redskin is today, the chances are they're going to say, oh, a football team in Washington. They know that they're not even talking about us. But it is a racial slur. It is a slur that reduces us to the outermost parts of our existence, our skin. That's what it reduces us to. And because we have a more color to our skin than white people, I think that's where the words come from. It's no different than the N-word. The N-word comes from the Latin word for black. And that's so this is that's where the N-word comes from. So I mean this is an exact example or analogy, I guess, to the N-word, the R-word. So again, we get lulled into this stuff. I've said this before as well. If you go back to the 50s, so much of our culture had been shoved underground. I mean, to be Native, look, if you were a Christian, you went to church every Sunday, you were fine. You could be a Native person in church. You could even sing the hymns in Mohawk. Back home, Ganawage, my aunt, who was a phenomenal singer, she was a Catholic. She actually sung for the Pope in the Vatican, sung hymns in Mohawk. Oh, wasn't that a beautiful thing? See, you could be accepted. I've heard, in fact, a guy who used to write for the Indian Country Today just passed away, Charles Trimble. I remember reading a story where he talked about how great the residential schools were. You know why they were great? Because he was already a Christian. He already spoke English. He already had been assimilated. So for him to go into a residential school, he was one of the good boys. So when you get so much of your culture gets trampled. Like I said, in the 50s, people who were tried to be traditional had lost so much that we would go to the Hollywood image of a native person. We were wearing Plains Indian headdresses. Our chiefs, in fact, when representatives of the Six Nations went down to Washington to officially declare war against the Axis powers in World War II, there's images of that. Look what they're wearing. They look like they came right off a Hollywood scene. They weren't wearing Gustoas. They weren't wearing antlers. Nope. They were wearing Plains Indian headdresses. Why? Because that's the image, that's what we thought we were. So anytime I hear people say, well, we had this, 500 years of continuous, practicing of our culture. Well, no, we've had some glitches along the way. But because of language, because of our ability to research, we know better now. You will never see a Haudenosaunee Ongwengwe dressed with a Plains Indian headdress, thinking that in any way, shape, or form that was culturally appropriate. No, you don't. We know better now because we know that Hollywood doesn't define us. The Washington football team's name isn't us. The Cleveland baseball cartoon image, Chief Wahoo, that's not us. So we have to be careful with language and appropriation. So as we appropriate their words, we also need to be careful. As we appropriate their concepts of land ownership, their concepts of citizenship or membership or nationhood, we don't need to be put in their box. I would much rather associate myself with other elements of creation, other animals, if you will, than other human beings. We live in a time, an unprecedented time right now because of this disease that is ravaging so much of the world, all of the world, actually. But the reality is man is the disease. And we demonstrate that with the way we've abused the planet, the way we've abused each other, the way we've abused other creation, whether we're talking about, whaling industry or the fishing industry or, agribusinesses, oil exploration and extraction, mineral extraction. We tear the crap out of everything. Everything is done based on a dollar value. And Native people, we're into it too. So we have to revisit things like our concepts, our words, our ideals. Look, I know we've been affected. Look, if we were able to come out of the 50s and shed the Hollywood images that we adopted to reclaim some authenticity of who we are, we still have a ways to go, folks. Look, I know everybody's consumed with, with stay-at-home orders. From a Native standpoint, that's not a terrible thing, folks. I'm hoping that we come out of the other side of this thing. We come out of the other side of this thing with a renewed sense of self and identity. And then in doing so, others who are not Ongwengwe may learn something from that. Because you know what? You don't have power over things like, disease. You don't have power over, over what the planet is going to do, whether it's tight. I mean, when a tsunami kills 250,000 people the day after Christmas in 2004, where was man's sovereignty then? Where was man's power and authority then? Most of the concepts of power and authority are false. They're fake. They are not real. You know who they're real with? They're in the minds of other people, in the minds of the subjugated, in the minds of the ones who don't want to accept responsibility and pass that responsibility and authority over to somebody else. Authority and power is a man-made construct, just like good versus evil is. But responsibility, a bear knows what its responsibility is. A mother bear knows what its responsibility is. A male bear knows what its responsibility is. A wolf knows. All of other creations know. But man has a twisted idea. This idea that we have the power of reason to plan for the future and to make decisions that will impact 7 generations in a positive way, that it will do no harm to 7 generations. Even we have looked at as that, what can we do to get stuff, to accumulate consumables? We've got sucked into that too. See, the Europeans looked at this idea that the best thing to do was to accumulate wealth. And that was going to secure them at the expense of others. Because you can't have wealth. Wealth is always a relative thing. You can't have wealth without having poverty. And in the United States and in Canada and in the so-called developed world, that's what we see. The disproportionate accumulation of wealth, the disparity between wealth and poverty has put the entire planet at a tipping point. This disease, this COVID-19 disease, there should be lessons that come from this. And I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture. Again, as I said at the beginning of the show, good people will die because of this and have died. And there's no rejoicing victory that should come when mankind gets on the other side of this thing. We should be very reflective on what transpired, how we behaved, how we acted, our responsibility or lack of responsibility. We should be very, very thoughtful on how we responded to this and how people that we gave responsibility to responded to this. Because we're losing people. We're losing good people. Yeah, no, look, there's some people who may not be good that get struck down by this. But you know what? That's not what a virus or a disease worries about. They don't select. They don't target good versus evil or evil versus good. Again, that's a man-made construct. So again, I think it's really, really important that we as Onwe reflect on our circumstance today. I think we should take pride in some of the success that we've had. When we talk about, again, the movement that we've had in asserting our identity and asserting our distinction. I know sovereignty is what people have called the sovereignty movement. But even taking that, even understanding that this sovereignty movement should teach us something about what sovereignty is and why that needs to be put aside as well. Us wrapping ourselves up in this concept of sovereignty is no different than us wrapping ourselves up in the image that Hollywood created for us. So we need to take some stock in that. So I'm going to thank you for listening to the show. I hope anything I said here, it was never meant to offend anybody. I know sometimes these things can be disruptive because they're concepts that aren't talked about in such a way. But just think about it. Critical thinking. That's what we're calling for. I want to thank you for listening. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.